among rebels endless while I sing. For love of one's land is a terrible thing. It banishes fear with the speed of a flame, and it makes us all part of the patriot game.
Welcome to another episode of the Irish People podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Behans, in particular Brendan and Dominic, their upbringing, their writing and their politics. We are delighted to welcome actor and writer Paudge Behan, whose mum was Beatrice Behan, wife of Brendan, and historian, writer and broadcaster Donal Fallon. You're both very welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kiva. Hello, Donal. How are you?
Glad to be here.
So if we could start then with the Behan Furlong family and how family influenced them.
I suppose, as you know yourself, Kiva, being a parent, we start with the parents.
Yeah.
Because they do have that kind of influence sometimes. And I suppose, people used to say about Brendan that, he got his stories and his love of republicanism from Kathleen, and he got his sharp wit from Stephen Behan. And Kathleen was born in, apparently, I've just made some notes here, in 1889. Two sisters, 8 years old when her father died, and her mother put the girls in the Golden Bridge orphanage for 6 years, where she became a reader. Then she left and rejoined her family in a one-room tenement in Gloucester Street, and she married Jack Furlong in 1916. She would also have been around 24 for the Great Lockout, and she would have been 27 when she got married to Jack Furlong. Or no, she was not. It was 1916. She was 27 when she married. She worked for Maud Gonne as a housekeeper, where she met W.B. Yeats. Then Jack Furlong died. I think it was the drink that killed Jack, actually. And then she met Stephen Behan, who was a member of the IRA, and he'd also been one of Michael Collins's 12 apostles, who were responsible for the shooting of several officers in the British Army during the Irish War of Independence. And he was banned from a professional future career for refusing to swear allegiance to the British Crown during the War of Independence. I'm sure Donal would like to get a word in edgeways.
The difficulty of talking about the Behans as a family is there are just so many names in the mix. And if we're talking about the early days of this story, I think there are 4 big names. There's Behan, Kearney, Furlong and English. Exactly. And this is the kind of melting pot, the environment in which the Behan boys are raised. So look, we're all products of our family and our background. And I don't think it's a coincidence in some families, I think also of the Yeats brothers, William Butler and Jack, that when you get kind of literary or artistic siblings, they come in packs, and it happens because of the influence of households. So what you heard about Kathleen was true. Kathleen really raised her children with a great draw of not only, I suppose, the stories, but the streetscape, the urban environment. She would bring the kids on walks through the city centre and point out things like the Wilde family house at Merrion Square. And I think in some ways she's quite like Jane Wilde, actually, the mother of Oscar, who raised her boys on a steady diet of kind of poetry, literature and Irish nationalism. But Jack Furlong's a 1916 veteran from Belfast. That's an important part of the story too.
All right.
Brendan doesn't really spend a whole lot of time in Belfast as a writer, but that shapes the kids in their youth. And Kathleen remembered about Jack. He was a member of the Irish Volunteers with my brother Pater, and that meant we had everything in common. So that was enough for her. That was love in itself. But then on the other side of the family, you have Granny English, which is a peculiar name in a family with so much separatism.
Indeed.
Going on at its core. Stephen's mother. And what's really interesting about her is that Granny English, she's kind of fallen from... Ernie O'Malley had a great line about the working class in Ireland. He said that the layers of class are more than the layers of an onion. That's very, very true. And Granny English is a former landlord who's kind of fallen a few steps down the ladder in inner city Dublin. So the Behan where they sit on the ladder, it's a little bit like Sean O'Casey, who writes so much about growing up in tenement Dublin, but is far from the worst of tenement Dublin.
Well, they were definitely better off than the average person in tenements in Dublin, because, I mean, one of the main things would have been if they were late with the rent, they weren't going to get evicted.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's extraordinary to think, like when you look at, for example, the 1911 census, which of course is long before Brendan's born, but it's inner city Dublin in a similar time frame. You can see the layers of class within tenement blocks. You know, it's not street to street. It can be literally, it can be literally within the rooms of one single tenement. So they're better off than other people living on Russell Street. That's quite undeniable, I think. But the background, in which they're raised, it's the Furlong, Kearney, English, Behan milieu, if you will.
Sure. And as Brendan used to say, you know, when he was growing up, you know, to get enough to eat was an advantage, and to get drunk was an accomplishment.
But isn't it remarkable you made that point about how Kathleen worked in the house of Maud Gonne? And I found it interesting reading in memoirs of her experiences of working in that house, being chastised for spending too long on the stairwell talking to guests. Like, you know, the consciousness of class wasn't always there within broader nationalism. It's funny to think of Maud Gonne as someone who spoke of the emancipation of Irish women, but was giving out to the housekeeper for spending too long talking to Yeats. But that Kathleen was able to hold her own with people like Yeats. You know, Kathleen was a great mind who introduced her children not only to Irish nationalism, but to Shakespeare, you know, to the great works of literature. Again, not unlike Oscar's mother.
And Stephen, too, apparently used to read to them when they were kids, you know, Proust and Balzac and people like this as bedtime stories, and Dickens, and, you know, really kind of amazing stuff, not the average sort of bedtime stories for kids, especially not then, or whatever about whenever. But it was really kind of amazing what he did and stuff.
And I love that confidence in a working class family as well. It's your children to the broadest range of literature.
And that great love of literature as well, I think, which was the thing. And, you know, it was obviously something that, you know, Brendan, obviously, he had like kind of a photographic memory from some of the things. I remember being, you know, hearing some tapes of him talking, and he was recalling a letter and stuff. And this is also somebody who drank an enormous amount. You know, it wasn't just somebody fresh sort of recalling something. But when he recalled the letter that he was talking about, it was like as if he was holding it in front of him. And the lady who did the interview with him, Ray Jeff, said, you know, he had nothing in front of him. He just was doing it from memory. And it was just incredible, his overall memory for songs, you know, for stories, for history. I mean, and also as well, I mean, Kathleen was like sort of a folk song jukebox at funerals and weddings. I mean, my father, Cal, used to say that, like, you know, he would hear songs from Kathleen that he had never heard before. And he was no mean remembrance either of Republican songs and of songs, you know, from Ireland and stuff. He was incredible. But he used to say Kathleen was the most amazing memory and the most amazing repertoire of songs that he'd ever heard. She had different songs, like, for every occasion. And some of these songs, she would have been probably one of the last people to actually have had them.
There was definitely going to be a political radicalism within them both. I mean, Michael O'Sullivan, who I think was Brendan's best biographer, and there's been several, but I think Michael was the best. He talks about the environment in which they grow up. You know, Kathleen seeing the red flag to them in the cot. There's a great quote about Granny Furlong, Jack's mother. Her philosophy was that God was good and Lenin wasn't a bad man either. It was a philosophy that her daughter-in-law also professed without reservation. And
That's a great quote.
It's a great quote. When they go on that move from Russell Street to Crumlin, I think the lads can't decide where they live. You know, Dominic jokes to Hell or to Kimmage. Brendan's adamant it's Crumlin, but even today the landlords can't decide if it's Crumlin or Kimmage. But when they go on that great trek out into the new distant suburbias, there's all kinds of interesting political agitation that comes with that. You know, at the time, Brendan's political consciousness happens around the time that Fianna Fáil come to power as a young man. You know, there's a lot of politics in the new suburbs and in unemployment and the likes in 1930s Dublin. So I think it was a combination of the time that the lads are coming of age and also the influence of socialism from Kathleen and Granny Furlong. They couldn't really escape.
And also as well, when they moved to Crumlin, as they also refer to it as where they eat their dead, they said basically that the neighbours apparently used to call the house in Kildare Street because there was so many meetings in it, Republican and Socialist meetings. They referred to it as the Kremlin. And during the emergency, Kathleen apparently fought with local shopkeepers when they ignored price controls, and she was called a red, to which she'd reply, "I'm not a red, I'm a scarlet."
But the idea, I remember coming across that in something by Dermot Bulger. He talks about the house as the Crumlin Kremlin, which sounds fantastic. But when there's battles around rent controls going on, and Herbert Sims, the housing architect for Dublin Corporation, had built all those houses. He made the very valid point that if you rehouse populations of thousands of people and you don't provide for the other amenities of life, you're going to end up with social alienation. Yeah. And Brendan jokes about that when he says there's no suburbia, only Siberia. It felt like they're tossed out into the middle of nowhere. But I think, in its own strange way, there's so much literature about Dublin city. When you think of Dublin between the canals, it recalls so many writers. Well, there's so little of suburbia and that different experience. And one of the things that's really unique about the Behan siblings is they're probably the first great writers to tackle suburbia and the alienation of suburbia in their writing.
Looking at the move to Kimmage/Crumlin, I always got the sense that it wasn't a welcome move, that people didn't want to move away from the community of the tenements.
Definitely. No, I think as well, the way people were spaced out as well in, outside the centre of Dublin in the new housing stuff development. I mean, before these people more or less shared a building together. And also they knew each other for a very long time. And they also could rely on each other, from everything to looking after the kids, to getting a lend of money, to cooking for their kids if that woman couldn't get home because she was working. I mean, it was like a whole sort of like, a creche mixed with a money lending area, mixed with like, an illegal, drinking establishment, mixed with a music and a cultural centre, all in one. And then suddenly this thing was totally broken up into pieces, and these people were fragmented into different areas and different places with people they never even knew and didn't know. And obviously the relationships would have to be all built up again over a long time. Yeah,
absolutely. And, I think one of the things about Brendan in particular that is often played up, like there's a lot of play acting on Brendan's part when it comes to the question of the urban and the rural. And for all his jokes of Jackie and V. Culchie, he is someone who's very in touch with rural Ireland throughout his entire life.
Absolutely.
He's someone who goes in search of the stories of the Gaeltacht, the stories of the Aran Islands. He meets Peg Sayers. A lot of the stuff about everyone beyond the canals being a Culchie is just classic kind of Behanism, and there's a biting wit in it more than anything. But
it's
I think
totally true.
What Kathleen says about Crumlin when they go there, she says the spirit of the place, the spirit of Russell Street is what she missed. And when I was working with Henrietta Street, the Tenement Museum, we did a lot of oral history with people who moved a bit later in the 50s to Donnycarney and Ballyfermot. Ballyfermot was called Ballyfarrow. People felt like it was beyond the moon, in Dublin vernacular. Crumlin was that bit closer. You could, realistically, from Kildare Road, stroll into the city in 20-25 minutes. And yet there was this mental wall, if you will, that was the canal as far as they were concerned. So Brendan in particular always writes of it as a very rural place. Dominic jokes about it. He says, they could have, home from home, it could have been for the rural, for the Culchies, as he says, if they put them there. But to us, it was like a world removed. But Crumlin now, to my mind, is like an inner sub. Crumlin is so close to the city centre. We can wonder what they were talking about. There are also people there's a handful of memoirs from people who lived in Crumlin before those houses were built. So, and it's interesting to read them because it's not just the people from the city who are being moved out and think, wow, what's this? A woman called Fiona Watchorn, who was raised in Crumlin, she wrote about how we couldn't believe all these houses looked the same. She said all our houses had unique names and land around them. And she says, how could these new children find their homes? To her, it was like monopoly. All these endless repeated houses. So it was a culture shock for everyone, in a sense. But these endless rows of houses in the 30s,
Yeah.
Another dimension of it is that Crumlin would have been quite rural, even beyond the new houses that were built. Crumlin and Kimmage develop in bits. So that offered opportunities in some ways. And the boys kind of talk about how when you're in the Fianna Éireann, the Republican Boy Scouts, there's a fair bit of drilling that goes on in places like rural Crumlin. You know, it has an air of sedition that the busy, watched city centre doesn't have.
Well, it was there that Dominic became involved, wasn't it, with the Fianna Éireann, was actually out in Crumlin. And apparently the first poems and prose of the organisation's magazine, the Fianna, he wrote for. And he also got involved, apparently, in the failure of the government at the time to tackle unemployment. And he actually went to jail for this particular campaign, protesting against the government's treatment of the Irish working class at the time.
Yeah, it's great to read the early stuff that the boys publish in the Republican periodicals. And they're quite good. They're quite good. Like Brendan's first published poem is called Red Envoy, 16 years of age. Just the last part of it. I see this old bad order die in a great swift blaze of fire, a structure clear and mighty high, born in its funeral pyre. Worker know the world's for thee, wert thou to rouse the servile knee from on the ground. So you can see the influence of their mother and indeed their grandmother in those very early poems that are published by the boys. And they're far above the standard of doggerel. You know, when you read the early work of both Brendan and Dominic, you have a sense that there's a great young writer developing in each. And
even a bit of Shakespeare thrown in there as well.
Yeah.
You know, which apparently Stephen used to read to them as well when they were in bed and stuff. You know, it was another one of the sort of things that he used to read to them, which is kind of amazing.
And what I like about that is it busts this myth of Irish republicanism being an insular thing or an in-looking thing. It's much like Patrick Pearse. You know, when you look at the library of Pearse's father, he raised his children on a similar diet of Shakespeare, of the great works of literature. So it reflects itself definitely in their writing. And Brendan's ability right throughout his life to quote Shakespeare at will is a product of boyhood.
In relation to Borstal Boy, does that show a shift in Brendan's political thinking?
It's a very important question too, because I mean, Borstal Boy is the first thing I think you realise is when you read Borstal Boy. I mean, apart from this 16-year-old who was just doing this totally crazy thing and stuff, even though he very much believed in it, but for somebody of 16 to be as active as he was at the time was even strange then. And you know, when Brendan was incarcerated and stuff, you know, first of all, like on remand, and then was later sent to Borstal and stuff. I mean, when he met, like, you know, Charlie Millwall in particular, you know, who was actually an English sailor, and who was also like somebody who Brendan was in Liverpool to try and blow up a battleship. And he obviously had the intellect to realize at one stage that it could easily have been somebody like Charlie Millwall who was on the battleship. And the thing you really realize, I think, about reading Borstal Boy, apart from the fun, the very strong political message that Brendan has in it and holds to, is also the humanitarian side of Brendan's writing, of the way he presents the screws, the way he presents the arresting officers. He could so easily have portrayed them as some type of monsters, which many of them were. Yeah. But he doesn't. He portrays them as people, as how they were. And this gives an amazing sense of the book, of this young guy doing something that he really believes. And here's the blueprint of the world of what's happening at the moment, which is kind of funny too, because all these people in the news that you read about, and were they radicalized? Were they not radicalized? Are they just a lunatic? Are they somebody who needs psychiatric care, which most of them seem to be without getting into things. But you know, here's this radicalization of somebody and stuff. And yet at the same time, Brendan talks about his friend Charlie Millwall and then has this kind of sort of, you know, sea change of thinking about people and people as people. And then he says a very important line in Borstal Boy was that when they meet an upper middle class prisoner in Borstal, Brendan says that he was more of an outcast than me. Even though I was Irish, I was Republican, and I was looked upon as a terrorist, you know. This guy, he said, we had all done the pawn. Our fathers and mothers had all done the pawn. The English ones, the Irish ones, the Liverpool ones, they'd all been in that situation economically. But this guy had never been in this situation. And even though he was from the same country as them, he was more of an outcast than anybody else was. And this was another interesting thing in the book and stuff. And also Brendan's idea of religion and how that was threatened in the book as well by the priest and the way the priest reacted to him. And basically, you know, told him he was going to be excommunicated and he couldn't come to church service in the prison like he would have liked to have those few hours of relief from a prison cell. And it's a really amazing book about somebody's, you know, coming of age, and also, you know, the way that they start to review things differently in their mind. And it's an incredible book, apart from its fun and its political sense, I think.
Yeah, one thing I really take from it is that, you know, Brendan, he seems to be fighting the wrong war in the wrong army. And the statement that he claims to have given to the Lime Street police reflects his own kind of youthfulness and how his ideology is very different from that of the IRA of the day. My name is Brendan Behan. I came over here to fight for the Irish workers and small farmers.
Farmers, yeah.
And this is a time when the IRA has totally drifted away from any kind of social radicalism. And, you know, it's probably the misfortune of Brendan, but the good fortune of us and the good fortune of Irish literature and the good fortune of the Behan family that he wasn't born 10 years earlier. Because if Brendan was, you imagine Spain is the battlefield you would have longed for. I think when you read what Behan is saying, what he thinks the IRA is at the time he's in England involved in this activity, it isn't necessarily. But, you know, I think Behan 10 years older would certainly have found his way onto the battlefield of Spain in the 30s.
But it's funny that you say that, Donal, about Spain and stuff, you know, because Brendan actually applied to the Spanish Civil War to join and actually got a mobilization letter back to the house when they lived in the inner city. And Kathleen took the letter and threw it in the fire and burnt it.
and given the great talent that was lost in Spain, like the poet Charlie Donnelly, aren't we all better?
Yeah.
Dominic had his own political journey. Would it be fair to say that he was even more left-wing than Brendan?
Well, actually, he was very left-wing. There's no question about that and stuff. But I think as well, with the two of them, particularly, their art and took over more than their politics. You know, I mean, Brendan said at one stage he was too old to fight and too fat to run. You know, and the other thing we must remember as well, when we're talking about the Behans, is Brian Behan. Brian Behan is the sort of unmentioned Behan brother, you know, and Brian in some ways was just as radical as Brendan. I mean, you know, Brian, you know, went off to London when in the 1950s and worked as a labourer, and then became involved with this anarchy syndicalism, as it was called, which was revolutionary industrial unionism. And he was imprisoned in Brixton for leading a go slow on the strikes. He also organised a lot of strikes on different sites all over London, Wimpy, McAlpine, all these big sites, because of the amount of Irish workers that were dying at the time, because there was 2 or 3 people dying a month or sometimes more, and they were just replaced the next day. There was no insurance. You know, people working in the rain got all types of diseases. People were killed, crushed, you know, and Brian started all these strikes and brought some of the biggest sites in London, including the Shell site, that Brendan came over and joined them on the picket lines. And Brian, you know, became extremely involved in this. And he was so looked upon at the time of the London of the late 50s, so dangerous and stuff, that he was blacklisted from nearly all the major building companies in London. He could never get a job and stuff. And then he became very involved with the Communist Party of Great Britain. And he became on the executive committee. And then afterwards, he went on a tour of Europe, Russia, and China, and he met Stalin and Mao Zedong. And then Brian came back to London, was extremely left wing, and then after the Soviets invaded Hungary, he totally started to write these articles about the communist government, which people I know in Ireland, you know, my father included, they never ever spoke to him again. Now, he had a sea change pretty similar to Brendan in a way about his politics. In fact, there were certain things that he thought were acceptable and certain things he thought weren't acceptable.
It's extraordinary to think of the influence of Britain on Irish migrants politically right through the 20th century, like things like the Connolly Association, for example, which radicalizes the Irish diaspora. But I think one thing about Dominic is the time that he spends in Scotland, which is very different. Like Dublin is a city that's not defined by industry. Dublin is defined by the absence of industry, right through the 19th and 20th centuries. But Dominic, after his release from prison, departs for Glasgow. And in Glasgow, you do have the memory of things like the Red Clydeside, as they call it, in the early 20th century, of a tradition of kind of militant socialism in the docks of Glasgow. He's lodging for a period with Hugh McDermott.
That's right. He taught him a lot.
A lifelong kind of peculiar kind of a political mix that is not unlike what Dominic develops in his views on his own country. It's a fusion of Scottish nationalism and communism. And we get kind of good insights into Dominic's political views. A very interesting interview he gives in the 50s at Socialist Review, and he makes the argument that the occupation of any part of Ireland by a foreign army is wrong. Two separate socialisms is a false, dangerous argument designed by jingoists to betray the Irish Workers' Republic. The only true progressive slogan for us can be unity and socialism. And that's a direct dig at kind of British and Ulster socialists who argue that there was no need to kind of remove partition. So I think Dominic's politics are very, very shaped by people like Hugh McDermott, who he meets in Glasgow. Josephine Quinn herself, her politics, she's steeped in Scottish communism too. And Brian has that as well. Brian has that experience of being around the British left, which is a minefield ideologically, but they all pick up things there as they go. And Brendan, because of the meteoric rise of his own career, doesn't have that same experience that Dominic and Brian have of mingling in the British left and picking up ideology from it.
No, even some of the groups, the far left-wing groups that Brian started, he was eventually thrown out of, and then he ended up apparently in this thing called the Trotskyist group called the Club, which was like his final sort of, place where he sort of, ended up sort of disgruntled and not with many members apparently. But I remember Brian and stuff, and he had incredible stories, and he was an incredible guy. And I always thought it was such a shame at the funerals and stuff that so many people wouldn't speak to him. I didn't really know why, because, I wasn't sort of versed in that so much. And but I always thought it was kind of a shame. And he was an incredibly entertaining guy. And he'd gone through a lot and he'd done a lot for what he believed and stuff,
Brilliant, isn't it? And I mean, the other part of Britain is not just political, it's cultural. That Dominic is in Britain at a time when there's an incredible folk revival happening there. We think about the folk revival as the Dubliners and everything that happened around Marion Row and I don't know, but Dublin is late. Dublin is late. It happens in Britain in the 1950s.
For sure.
It happens with people like
Ewan MacColl.
It happens with this working men's culture, that's in Northern England, but also in London. People like Seamus Ennis, Margaret Barry. There's a lot of cultural stuff happening that's radical in its own ways in Britain in the 50s, and Dominic's a real part of that. And I think Dominic's real success is in that broader sphere of culture, like in terms of songwriting, song collecting, and a bit like Luke Kelly. People laugh when you say this, but Luke Kelly would not have been the same talent he was without England. And I think you could say the same thing of Dominic, that the folk revival that he witnessed in Scotland and England
absolutely
definitely molded him.
And apparently, Dominic, Seamus used to tell me that sometimes Dominic would pick him up. And Seamus was working as an electrician. Seamus was another one of the Behans. And Seamus would be working as an electrician in London and stuff. And Dominic would ring him up or sometimes just call to the house in Tooting. And he'd have a big chauffeur-driven car that would be taken and say, do you want to come with me? Do you want to come with me? I'm going to sing a few songs, So Seamus would say, yeah, I'll go with you and stuff. So they jump into the car and go off and he wouldn't really know where he was going. And about an hour and a half later, they'd end up in some British Army barracks in the middle of nowhere in England. And then Dominic would proceed to take the stage and sing all these Irish rebel songs about blowing up soldiers, more or less. And he'd get this tumultuous, reception from 80% of the audience who are Irish English in terms of their parentage.
I think one of the great things about Dominic is that he's kind of like a sponge. He absorbs so much, and Dominic is sometimes accused by within the folk music community, you say, "Oh, Dominic didn't write that. Dominic didn't write that." But he's a bit like Seamus Ennis in the way that Ennis traverses across Ireland on bicycle in the 1940s and kind of gathers the last notes of what's a great dying civilization. These songs. Dominic absorbs these dying songs of the Irish diaspora and adds to them. Entire new verses, entire new flows to these songs, which are dying in the Irish clubs of London and Nottingham and Manchester and the like. So he's a kind of accidental sociologist, Dominic Behan. He may not intend to become a song collector as well as a songwriter, but he's the right man in the right place at the right time for what's happening in Britain. And the BBC, not for the first or last time, they recognise that and they take a punt on Dominic as a broadcaster, just as they do with Seamus Ennis, the Uilleann Piper. There seems to be, at that point in time, more willingness to engage with that culture in Britain than there was in Ireland.
Definitely. I mean, the other thing that's amazing too, Donal, I think, is that the similarities between Dominic and Bob Dylan are kind of amazing, because they were both sort of, what do you call it, traveling sort of, balladeers and picking up tunes as they went, like you said, and Dylan too. And it's funny that the two of them had this huge spat then later, with Dominic's song, The Patriot Game, because it was basically like, it was another one that Bob Dylan said, which was a thing called the Merry Month. It was taken apparently from the Merry Month of May, that he took some of the tune from, that Dominic took the tune from. And Bob Dylan had a song called With God on Our Side. And what's his name? Dominic publicly challenged Bob Dylan about the rights to the song, the tune, and some of the lyrics in it, which was, kind of amazing at the time for him to do this and stuff. And he never really, had a high opinion of Bob Dylan after that, and always said Bob Dylan was a plagiarist.
One song of Dominic's that I always really liked, and I'm amazed that so many people have missed it, was Arkle. Dominic was such a great storyteller, and his delivery in the song is absolutely perfect.
Yes, yeah, Liverpool Lou as well, and also apparently when Yoko Ono was on Desert Island Discs,
that's right.
One of the songs she picked was Liverpool Lou, because John Lennon apparently used to sing it to Julian when he was a baby in the crib. And this amazing connection that he had and this folk tradition and stuff. And also, of course, McAlpine's Fusiliers, which was became like every Irish navvy and labourer song and immigrant song for a very long time.
He has that great ability, Dominic, to respond to a breaking event. So the great kind of Arkle v Millhouse showdown, which is presented in the press as a good old Ireland v England race, despite Arkle's English ownership. That doesn't matter. It's Pat Taff, it's an Irish jockey, blah, 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 and it becomes this great one-up over the old enemy. But the ability to write a song like that quickly, and the ability to find the humor in news stories as they break, that's a real Behan trait. Brendan has it too. Brendan is probably the wittiest Irishman since Oscar Wilde, in the sense that he's able to come up with this humor on the spot. And you see that in a song like Arkle from Dominic. The Behans are always topical, and that's what's, I think, so great about both of their media appearances. When you see or hear Dominic or Brendan interviewed, they're not just people that can write on paper. They're people that have that ability to be in the moment. And Arkle, there's no better example of that than the song Arkle. And it's like a theatrical performance, Arkle, the way he's switching between those different performers, and just the way it ends, too early in the day, in that faux English accent. There's great Behan humor in that song.
No, total theatre, like you say, Donal. I mean, Joan Littlewood, was being asked in a documentary about, Brendan and theatre, and she turned around and said, well, Brendan was theatre, and it was like a marriage, like totally. And I remember the stories of my mother, like so many of them in different countries of the world, and the different instances of things that happened and stuff, and Cahill, my father as well, he grew up with Brendan and stuff, and one time Brendan, and also that sharp wit of Dublin, which is very well an Irish thing, I think, not just Dublin, but and also the idea of being able to put somebody in their place pretty quick if they stepped out of line. And I always remember Cahill was telling me once, when Brendan had come back from New York, and obviously done very well and stuff, and was wearing his coat of moor, as they used to call it, his cashmere coat and stuff, in some bar, like, down in the docks in Dublin and stuff. And the two of them were having some drinks and stuff, and some guy came into the bar and saw Brendan sitting there with his coat on and shouted over to him, Brendan Behan, I remember you when you didn't have an arse in your trousers. And Brendan turned around on the bar stool without missing a beat and just said to him, you don't fucking remember it half as well as I do.
Joan Littlewood, I remember reading her memoir, and she's a great line when she learns that Brendan is dead. She says, I was so angry, I wanted to go to Dublin and kick the coffin. That she regarded it as such a waste of talent on that news. And when you think of Dominic's success with the BBC as a broadcaster, and the fact that it was Littlewood and Littlewood's theatre that propelled Behan to stardom in Britain, they owed so much, the brothers, to culture in Britain. They owed so much. And even that wave of working class talent that came through, like Sheila Delaney, and so much of what Littlewood promoted was, the authentic Northern English working class voice. It's interesting that there was a space for Dublin talent in that, that the what was happening in working class English culture, be it folk and folk revival for Dominic, or the emergence of the angry young men and the angry young women for Brendan. They benefited from culture in Britain, arguably to a greater extent than culture at home. And the Abbey Theatre, never forget, kind of scorned Brendan until other people, like smaller theatres up back lanes in Dublin, like the Pike, brought Brendan to public prominence, and then the door was opened. But there are more doors opened in Britain to Dominic and Brendan than here at home.
By far. I mean, and the Theatre Royal in Stratford East was, the thing that actually brought him. That was the first major step of fame and stuff, in terms of Joan Littlewood being open to that sort of idea and that type of a person and stuff. And she was very far removed from the stuffed shirts of theatre at the time in England and stuff, which was just total sort of drawing room farces and situation comedies, and incredibly, whereas she basically revolutionized theatre in London at that time. And it was no accident as well that she was married to Ewan MacColl at one stage too, funnily enough. And like you said, it was this whole movement that was happening at the time, which gave birth to the 60s, obviously, and couldn't have happened the 60s in England without what happened beforehand, obviously. And the way Brendan was treated there, the way he was received, obviously the Malcolm Muggeridge interview on the BBC didn't do any harm and stuff, because it was probably one of the first times anyone had seen somebody, extremely drunk on television and stuff. And when asked afterwards, like, why was he drunk on the Malcolm Muggeridge show, and Brendan turned around and said, well, I'm normally drunk at 7 o'clock in the afternoon. And the fact of being on television didn't seem to make much difference about it,
Yeah.
And the other story I always, if I could just, Donal, just say, was when my mother was with Brendan, and the hostage had opened on, not the hostage, he was actually the queer fella, had opened, and they were going down to Liverpool, and Brendan insisted on going down to Liverpool to Walton Jail to see Cathal Gouldy, my father at the time, and he was incarcerated there, and they got the train down to see him, and they went and they saw him and stuff, and then they came. And another time when Brendan was passing back through the second time, he asked if he could, he insisted on going down to see Cathal again. And this time his visit was refused, and it was after the Malcolm Muggeridge interview. And Brendan was very, very depressed and, annoyed at the idea. And he knew it wasn't Cathal who refused his visit, because only one of two people can refuse to visit, either the governor or the prisoner. And so he asked afterwards and stuff, and Cathal was called out of the cell that day, and he was called into the governor's office, and the governor said to him, can you, step forward on the line? And so Cathal, repeated his number and stuff and told him, Goulding 657304. And the governor said, that man Behan came here again, and he was looking for to meet you again, to have a meeting with you. And Cathal said, is that so? And the governor said, yes. I refused the visit, he said. And Cathal said, well, I hope you told him that it was you that refused his visit and not me, And the governor said, he was drunk when he came here. Drunk like he was when he was on the Malcolm Muggeridge show. And Brenda Cal took one step forward towards the governor before he was grabbed and said to him, well, drunk or fucking sober, you'll never be on the BBC.
Wow, isn't that brilliant? And I think that BBC performance, like one part of that interview that's kind of often overlooked is that while people like the governor may have gone, this is a disgrace, I think a lot of working class English people found great pleasure in that. You know, I think they probably understood a working class Dubliner, drunk as he may have been, better than a highbrow BBC accent.
Well, totally. I mean, the next day, apparently, when he was walking around London, there was bus drivers shouting out the window, hey, Brendan, saw you on the Malcolm Muggeridge show last night. You were drunk, mate. Good on you. He was famous in a couple of days. Like, I remember my mother told me the same thing, you know. Brendan sat there with a stack of newspapers reading, and he was headlines on most of them and stuff. And then he went out on the street and people were speaking to him like he was a friend of theirs. He used to say himself, the only bad publicity is an obituary.
It predates television airing, you know, like the same as the American appearances on television. It predates really television as a... Like, television is so late in Ireland, really. Like, the visit of JFK is the first major kind of televised event in Ireland, which is extraordinary. We think about how late that is in the context of these islands. So Behan is a television celebrity before most Irish people have seen a television.
I think, though, that even if Ireland had television in every home, the likelihood is that the establishment wouldn't have wanted the likes of Brendan or Dominic having access to it, because they would have been afraid of what they would say or who they would influence. Like you mentioned with how the Abbey didn't exactly open its doors at the beginning.
Totally. I mean, there was also that, like, you know, hatred that Irish people had for Brendan because of how he let the side down. Mm-hmm. And here were all these people, not just in England, but in America as well, who had done everything they can to assimilate in this culture that they were in. And, you know, like any immigrants, a lot of immigrants that go to countries and stuff, they won't speak their national language. They adapt the language of the country they go to. They even the accent they want their kids to. I mean, and that goes right across the board, right across colours, right across nationalities. And today is still happening, obviously. And, you know, you see, like, you know, my mother was saying, like, when they were in America and stuff, she used to get these threatening phone calls, you know, from somebody who was Irish and stuff, and saying, get that drunk out of this country before we kill him. You know, he wasn't always appreciated by his own type. And also, when he did go back to Dublin in his latter days, when he was very nearly finished and stuff, he was constantly attacked by people in bars and places like that, because he could be very belligerent himself, but he was also attacked numerous times by people who just didn't like him, didn't like what he stood for, didn't like the fact, you know, that what they thought of, some people were obviously threatened by him, but regardless, he was attacked many times for just being himself.
I think there's a really beautiful and quite sad quote that ties into this of being in Dublin from Rory Furlong. And I think it says a lot about Brendan's desire to be liked. He said, I never met Brendan at any time when he didn't give me money. A few bob shillings now would be £10. A lot of money then, say around the 60s. And he did this for a lot of people. I know people who would come to him and they would say, we haven't got our electricity bill paid. Fellas were forever coming to him, and he would say, right, we'll go down now to the ESB, and he'd pay the bill there. And then he paid our rents too, for people living in flats and corporation houses. He'd pay up front. This is all forgotten. People who don't know any of this so-called research with regards to Brendan, never brought that into the public eye, never let the people know the humanitarianism of Brendan. I think he was someone who really desired to be liked, and was very conscious of criticism of this kind of, you know, this criticism of being a stage Irishman or a stage drunkard and the like. I think he took all that very, very personally, and he had a great desire to be to be liked and even loved by the working man.
Oh, totally. I mean, but he was also like an extremely generous person and stuff, and he knew what it was like to be broke, and he knew what it was to have money in his pocket and stuff, having many times not had it and stuff. And, you know, was generous to a fault, apparently, from what I've heard and stuff. And even when he went to America, and his days of being broke then were very much finished and stuff. And there's a lovely story that Allen Ginsberg tells about when they were living down in the East Village, and Brendan's play was on Broadway and stuff. And he came down to them because he was into the Beats, Jack Kerouac, you know, and also into, like, you know, some of the other writers at the time and stuff. And he went down to them and found them and stuff, and rang them up and said, you know, would you be interested in coming to my play? And Allen Ginsberg was talking, and he was saying we were living in this place. You know, we had no money at the time. We were totally broke. And he left these tickets at the box office. We went down, we saw his play. We thought it was, in Allen Ginsberg's words, really cute. And so then Brendan met them afterwards and took them all out for dinner, you know. And he again, Ginsberg saying, you know, he was such a lovely guy and stuff. And he was so generous to take us because we were starving poets at the time. And then he took them to dinner and stuff. And during the dinner, at one stage, Allen Ginsberg got up he said to go to use the toilet. And he went down to the toilet and stuff. And as he was down there, Brendan came crashing through the door, you know. And it wasn't a cubicle he was in, it was an open toilet and stuff. And Brendan said to him, how are you fixed for ammunition? You know, and Ginsberg, he said, well, I mean, you know, when he asked me, I knew he'd had a political history and he was militant. And I said, Brendan, I don't use guns. And he went, no, this ammunition. And he took out a roll of notes out of his pocket, dollars. And he gave Allen Ginsberg $80 cash in his hand because he was broke, because Allen Ginsberg said, I don't have any money.
Something that comes through in their writing very strongly is empathy. They had a huge amount of empathy. They could understand suffering because they had been through so much themselves.
In particular, the elderly, it's a noticeable theme of both Dominic and Brendan's work, a special respect for the elderly. And I wonder, is that the important role, the influence of grandmothers in their own boyhoods? But yeah, it really comes through in that empathy for the old is a reoccurring theme.
The thing that Brendan said about rules and regulations as well, I don't like rules and regulations, and the only rules that there should be is the ones that make the roads safer, the beer cheaper, and old men and old women warmer in the winter. Another thing, actually, my mother used to say was that when they used to get things through the door, you know, and obviously people used to call to the door as well. But one of the envelopes that arrived one time was the Widows and Orphans Fund of the police. And Brendan was actually giving a contribution every year to the Widows and Orphans of the police, the Garda Síochána, which my mother always found hysterical, considering.
There was a letter written about Brendan by a lighthouse keeper, I believe. I'm not sure if you came across it.
He is referred in the letter, he's referred to as the worst specimen of worker I've met in 30 years. That's all I remember of it from.
And the other part was that he mixes paint putty with his bare hands. And he uses a lump hammer to open the paint tins. And there are empty Guinness bottles throughout all rooms. You can put the rest together yourself, I think.
To finish up then, what is their legacy? Why are they important? And why is it important that people take the time to read them? I
was very struck by something Colonel West in America was talking about class. And he said, I don't like the term ordinary people. He said, none of us are ordinary. And he said, we're everyday people, the people who go to work every day and the people who carry the wheels of society every day. And I think there was a real tendency in Ireland for a long time not to think that the stories of everyday people were important. And what's interesting about so much of what Brendan and Dominic write, so much, now, not so much in the case of Dominic writes very good biographies too, but so much of what they write is autobiographical. And I think that's a big part of the story of the Behans, that they are capturing the story of a working class family. And I think, yeah, the contribution, the only in recent weeks, there was a conference in Liberty Hall, which was focused on working class literature in Ireland. And you can't talk about Irish working class literature without talking about the Behans. I think that's their great contribution, that who else would have thought that writing about things like the tenements of Russell Street or the alienation of suburbia, now we recognise that it is. So I think their greatest contribution is they are so much the great writers of Irish history, Shaw, Wilde and onwards. They come from a particular social class. They're the people who have the time to reflect, the time to write, the time to study. Remember, these are not boys who went to university. They write of their lived experience. And to me, they're the most important working class voices in the great canon of Irish literature.
I mean, I think it's strange as well that, like, in today's world, what's happening and stuff and what's changing and stuff. And especially now, like I was just reading something there the other day, and it was global inequality is marked as it was nearly as it was in the 20th century, pinnacle of Western imperialism. The difference now between the rich and the poor and stuff is exactly at the same position as it was then. And Brendan and Dominic and those people, they were like they were for a very good reason, because they realized what would happen and where they were going and what they could not achieve if there was no unity. And as Sean Garland said once, we are all nothing without each other. And it was a great saying. It was a great thing that he said and stuff, because it basically is exactly that. And now we've become more fragmented than ever because of the internet, because of these great new tools that we have on our phones and things like this. And I'm not knocking them. I use them. We all have to. But it's broken up the community even more. It's fractured it even more than it would be possible before. The reason that there's so many in London anyway, where I am at the moment, like kids just stabbing each other, 13, 14-year-olds killing each other. You know, they closed all the youth clubs. You know, the kids are on the street. They're just looking at the internet and seeing what they don't have and what they'll never have. You know, it's a time more than ever that like unity between people and knowledge of the past, and also how to do things and how to change things. And also unions will come back, I think, even stronger than ever, as they have to, because we are going to be at the mercy of these. We thought we had multinational companies before. Well, what do we have now with Amazon, with Google, with Apple? These are super, super, super multinational companies. And are these people going to look after the workers? Are these people going to look after the people who are, you know, in China or wherever? I mean, is that a realistic idea? I mean, this is going to come back on itself, I believe, more than ever before. And people like them, their songs might even be sung again in totally different countries than they ever were before.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
very well said.
Thank you both so much for taking part in this episode. I've really enjoyed it.
Ah, it was great.
It was great. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, it was good for the soul.
And thank you all for listening. We'll be back again next month with another episode. So until then, slán go fóill.